Welcome to the 19th Century Novel Podcast, Episode 28, Louis Couperus, The Hidden Force, Part 1. The Dutch ruled the East Indies for roughly 3 centuries, except for brief periods of French and British and Japanese rule during the Napoleonic Wars and World War II. Over this long period, the manner of Dutch rule of the islands changed, as we can see in Louis Couperus's novel The Hidden Force, published and set in 1900. Just as in Multatuli's Max Havelaar, the action takes place on the island of Java, in a colonial system that depends on a hierarchy of colonial administrators, residents, assistant residents, and controllers, and native chiefs or regents. It's a system meant to profit the Dutch through trade in commodities, mostly by exporting sugar and coffee. Reacting against charges by Multatuli and others that this system, the culture system, was cruelly exploitative, even leading to famine, the Dutch by the 1860s transformed this system into something more liberal and humane, but a system that still promoted their national economy and trade. The culture system that Multatuli decried wasn't slavery, but it was a form of control and domination that went against the liberal reformist sentiment developing in mid and late 19th century Europe. As the historian Bernard H. M. Vlecka observes, in the long run, there was no escape from the conclusion that the principles of liberalism were irreconcilable with a system of government enterprises based on compulsory labor and trade monopolies. Consequently, in the 1870s, the Dutch modified this system, abolishing compulsory labor and establishing something more like a free market system. Liberal reformers hoping, according to Vlecka, that the same methods that had caused the rapid economic development of Europe and America in the 19th century would set in motion the power of production of the East as well. As part of this strategy, the Netherlands in the East Indies changed its colonial model from one with a mostly male European ruling population to a more residential model, which gave space to husbands and wives and families. In other words, it changed from a colony that relied on a small population of European merchants and Dutch administrators and soldiers who maintained power through native intermediaries to a settler colony. In Java, the Dutch constructed a domestic world and social environment centered on an administrative hub, the city of Batavia, now Jakarta, a social world that was modeled on their European homeland. But this community could never precisely mirror this distant homeland, since it always incorporated elements of native culture, and since its population included many who were born in the Indies and had mixed-race parentage. This group has been known by several names, including Indo-European, Indo, Indisch, Inlander, and Mestizo, a confusion stemming in part from the desire to distinguish between people by their place of birth, Europe or the Indies, and their ethnic heritage, white European or mixed race. I'll use the old-fashioned term Eurasian to refer to people of mixed European and Indies ancestry, and will explain contextually the differences between the European and the native-born. On top, or perhaps beneath this layer of racial and social complexity, lies the indigenous Javanese culture, with its unique customs and hereditary aristocratic rule. Thus, Couperus dramatizes a world in which Europeans struggle to maintain a semblance of their cultural identity and dominance against both a hybridized Eurasian and alien Javanese cultures. The Hidden Force doesn't follow the typical narrative structure of the 19th century realist novel, in which, after an initial conflict, a plot unfolds and subplots unfold, sweeping the reader along to an eventual resolution. Instead, the first part of Couperus's novel is built upon character studies, focusing in particular on how these European transplants and Eurasians have adapted to Java. These early chapters tend to focus on a particular character, often with little or no story to tell. With their detailed examination of individual psyches, these character studies sometimes suggest the influence of Henry James, but without James's deep characterological dissection or labyrinthine syntactical constructions. Couperus's character studies do eventually shift into a narrative, but not in the way that, say, Dickens unites a disparate assemblage of people through the convolutions of plot. The characters in The Hidden Force are linked more by theme. Couperus is interested in seeing how individuals, especially Europeans in Java, are shaped by and respond to their social, cultural, and natural environments. Couperus opens the novel by describing a dusk settling onto a sun-wearied landscape in images that suggest mortality, a hue of tragedy, a deadly stillness, a veil of silence, a windless oppression, a muffled silence, quiet houses shrinking away in deathly silence. The scene begins with a view of the rising moon, then descends to the tree line, then to avenues and gardens, then to the houses where our approach seems to have set some dogs to barking before they settle back into sleepy watchfulness, and we arrive at the Residency, a building with the zigzag outline and primitive shape and irregular roofs of Java, while the white pillars of the portico, tall, bright, and stately, with wide intervals, with a large welcoming spaciousness, with an expansive and imposing entrance, present a European facade. Couperus then takes us on a tour of the finely manicured grounds, the roses and chrysanthemums and palms and caladiums and lantana and water lilies, the gravel path and wide lawn and flower pots and monumental vase and pond and flagstaff, the Dutch flag lowered for the night, the entrance gate closed to the street. With its pillars and its vanishing perspective of roofs, the residence, writes Couperus, is reminiscent of a child's dream. One native attendant walks quietly and leisurely to a bronze bell, sounding 7 slow reverberating strokes. The clapper struck the bell with a brazen booming note, and each stroke was prolonged by an undulating echo, a deep thrilling vibration, a music accompanied by a chorus of dogs' barks. The attendant, boyishly slender in his blue cloth jacket with yellow facings and trousers with yellow stripes, slowly and quietly retraces his steps. We see a light shining in an office, and the resident, a tall, heavy man in a black jacket and white duck trousers, who walks across the room and calls to the chief attendant outside. This opening, which takes us from one illumination to another, from a red moon to the resident's lighted office, places Dutch rule in the center of the cosmos. Or perhaps the opposite, its well-tended lawns suggesting the artifice of this rule versus the vigor of tropical nature, of Java itself. But there seems no question who's in charge here. The servant approached with bended knees and squatted before his master. The resident asks this oppasser, a Dutch word for servant, where someone named Miss Doddy is. The servant replies, "She is out, Kanjiang," using a Malay word that might be translated as "my lordship." Couperus will incorporate many Malay words and phrases untranslated into the novel. More than 100 are listed in the glossary supplementing the translation I'm using. Accompanied by the torch-bearing oppasser, the resident leaves his grounds to walk in the town of Labuwangi, based on the town of Pasuruan, past the villas of the more prominent notables of the town, and through the darkened well-off Dutch and European community, passing all the markers of Western civilization, a girls' school, then the notary's house, a hotel, the post office, the Catholic church, the railway station. The streets are deserted but for an occasional Javanese who, like a moving shadow, appeared out of the darkness. Couperus explains that, knowing their position vis-à-vis the Dutch, the Javanese understood and made himself small, cowering along the edge of the road and passing with a scuttling gait. The resident finds his way to the Concordia Club, in which is centered the social life of the European community, explains the literary scholar E.M. Beekman. We see a quintessential colonialist setting. A couple of native servants in white jackets sat on the steps. A European in a white suit, the steward, passed along the veranda. But there was no one sitting at the great gin and bitters table, and the wide cane chairs opened their arms in vain expectation. These vacant chairs mirror the resident's mood. After a full day serving the colonial administration, he longs for human contact, for his daughter's arms around his neck, or his wife's smiling greeting. As head resident, he is practical, cool-headed, decisive, due to the long habit of authority, but also isolated by his need to maintain a sober public face, to be a representative of the government, to command respect. He does not stop to speculate about what for him is an uncommon sentimental feeling, does not wonder about what has caused an introspection so alien to his nature. For it was not, Couperus writes, his custom to indulge in musings. This uncharacteristic feeling of loneliness stems from the unacknowledged emptiness of his work and dissatisfaction with his family. His loneliness is exacerbated by the setting, by the haunting melancholy of the seas of Java, the melancholy that rushes in from afar on whispering mysterious wings. But the resident shows no interest in understanding the melancholy that has overtaken him. On the contrary, he denied mystery. It was not there. There was only sea and the cool wind. There were only the fumes from that sea, a blend of fish and flowers and seaweed. For the resident, there exists just the tangible and practical. The ocean breeze carries only the ripening smells of nature, with nothing ineffable that might move him spiritually or emotionally. While the resident dismisses mystery, his opposer believes in a supernatural presence. He knows the sea spirits are about now. There are crocodiles under the water, and every crocodile is a spirit. Rice, dried beef, and hard-boiled egg float in a sort of bamboo raft, offerings made under the belief that these will propitiate the crocodiles and make worshippers invulnerable to their bite. The opposer views this Hollander's behavior, just staring emptily out at the sea, with no sense of the spirits that inhabit it, odd and ignorant. In this opening, Couperus establishes the novel's central concern: the struggle of Westerners to understand and appreciate this mysterious land and its people. The resident, quintessentially European and rational and duty-bound, returns to his residence, dismissing whatever glimmer of understanding he's just experienced, denying he's had any experience at all, and sits down to finish some paperwork before dinner. And he wonders who the two figures, a man and a woman, were who had vanished at his approach. We will soon learn that they are his daughter Doddy and a young Javanese male, Addy de Luce. It's possible that Couperus's crepuscular opening was influenced by the opening of Joseph Conrad's first novel, Almayer's Folly, which had been published 3 years earlier. Both novels begin with a dusky setting and a protagonist upset with his family life, contemplatively staring at a body of water. Leaning with both his elbows on the balustrade of the veranda, Conrad writes, he went on looking fixedly at the great river that flowed, indifferent and hurried, before his eyes. He liked to look at it about the time of sunset, perhaps because at that time the sinking sun would spread a glowing gold tinge on the waters of the Pantai, and Almayer's thoughts were often busy with gold. The golden-hued sunset conveys visions of wealth to Almayer, whereas from a similar setting, the protagonist of Couperus's novel feels a melancholy resignation, a loneliness, a longing, a desire, a certain nostalgia. The second chapter of The Hidden Force opens as does the first, with light. In the residence, lamps had been lit everywhere. No fewer than 20 or 30 paraffin lamps burning in chandeliers and lanterns, but they provided no more than a vague yellow twilight throughout the house. By contrast, a stream of moonlight floated over the garden, making the flower pots gleam brightly until they shimmered in the pond. The vague light associated with the colonialist, with the Enlightenment West, in this case multiple kerosene lanterns, is outshone by the light of Java, a stream of moonlight that floats and gleams and brightens and shimmers. Couperus takes us to the outside of the residence, where on the veranda sits a bored young man and a young girl expectantly humming to herself. Then we step inside. In keeping with realist conventions, Couperus presents the interior inventory of a house furnished, he writes, with commonplace splendor. It's an official residence with virtually no genuine individual touches. Chairs lined up against the wall as though in readiness for an eternal reception, a huge red satin curtain falling from a gilt cornice, mirrors in gilt frames, their lower edges resting on marble console tables, and Renaissance-era lithographs, with the biggest space reserved for a lithograph of Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands. Everything was very neatly kept, writes Couperus, and distinguished by a pompous banality. This pompous banality is repeated on the veranda, where a long table is set for a dinner for three, which 6 boys wearing white jackets with red linen facings serve quickly and noiselessly. Steak and salad were served, a pudding, followed by fruit. The dinner is consumed by 3 Dutch occupants of this fine home. Doddy, olive-complected with black hair, about 17, and looking much like her mother, the resident's first wife, who now runs a gambling house in Batavia. A young man, Theo, 23, but looking 5 years older, tall, broad, and fair-haired, with a blonde mustache. And their father, the officious and equally tall and sturdy resident, Otto Van Oudijck, whom we've followed on his melancholic wandering out of and back to the residence. Receiving no information about the identity of the vanishing couple, after a 20-minute supper, Van Oudijck returns to his work. Once he's gone, Dottie admits to her brother that her father had seen her with Addie. Theo teases her about this relationship, to which Dottie responds with suggestive comments about Theo's relationship with his stepmother, the resident Van Oudijck's second wife. The next morning, Theo takes the carriage to the station to pick up his stepmother, Léonie, and her 2 young stepsons, and his brothers, René and Rikus, who had been on a 2-month holiday with their stepmother in Batavia, about 500 miles away. As Theo helps his stepmother down from her carriage, she smiles ambiguously and allows him a kiss on her cheek. This woman, the 30-year-old Léonie Van Oudijck, is one of the novel's most striking characters, a woman of singular beauty and poise and self-assurance and hedonism. A tall woman with a fair complexion and fair hair, she possessed the languid dignity of women born in Java, daughters of European parents on both sides. She had something that attracted attention at once. It was because of her white skin, her creamy complexion, her very light blonde hair, her strange gray eyes. It was because of her eternal smile. One could never tell at the first sight of her whether she concealed anything behind that glance, whether there was any depth, any soul. She took an interest only in her own body and her own soul. All the rest was totally unimportant to her. Leonie's power comes from her beauty, a purebred blonde European beauty, not the mixed-race identity of the many Dutch Javanese inhabitants, although she is identified as a milky white Creole. This identification, a woman who appears white and who, Couperus assures us, had European parents on both sides, as Creole, is an indication of the complex and contradictory conception of race in the European community of Java. Though she looked very European, it may have been her leisurely walk, writes Couperus, that languid dignity that was the only Indies characteristic that distinguished her from a woman newly arrived from Holland. Seemingly, then, it's her sensuality, her leisurely walk and languid dignity that mark her as Creole, unlike the presumably more proper and purposeful demeanor of European women. It's tempting to describe Léonie as narcissistic, but that term doesn't fit because while she's aware of her beauty, she doesn't obsess over it. Rather, she takes her beauty and the power it gives her as natural and inevitable. It is inseparable from, and perhaps the only feature of her self-identity. She has no interest in other people, and seems to have no interior life. The sole purpose of her life is to give herself pleasure, and to dismiss without a thought conventional moral codes. Her face displayed a certain satisfaction, Couperus writes, but especially that radiant, laughing indifference, as though nothing could harm her, as though she were protected by a mysterious force. In his depiction of Léonie, we see one of the hallmarks of this book, Couperus's lengthy explication of character. For instance, about Léonie he continues, "She looked as though life would have no hold on her, neither on her complexion nor on her soul. She looked as though she were incapable of suffering, and it seemed as though she smiled and were thus contented, because no sickness, no suffering, no poverty, no misery existed for her. An irradiation of glittering egoism encompassed her, and yet she was, for the most part, lovable. She was charming and prepossessing because she was so pretty. This woman, with her sparkling self-satisfaction, was loved, whatever people might say about her. When she spoke, when she laughed, she was disarming and, even more, engaging. This was despite, and perhaps just because, of her unfathomable indifference. She took an interest only in her own body and her own soul. Everything else, everything was totally indifferent to her. Unable to give anything of her soul, she was incapable of feeling save for herself. But she smiled so peacefully and enchantingly that she was always thought lovable, adorable. Couperus goes on for another page or so, delineating Léonie's character. In essence, she has no essence, nothing substantial. As a rule, Couperus explains, she did nothing but dream. Her dreams were vague imaginings, which rose before her as in an azure mist during her afternoons of solitude. At a time when reading novels was a popular entertainment, Léonie reads little other than magazines, although Couperus tells us she did have a favorite writer, Catulle Mendes, the author of novels which, asserts Beekman, were redolent with situations and perversions we would now call soft porn. Mendes died in 1909 in a particularly gruesome fashion, as the New York Times reported. It is thought that Mr. Mendes, who had boarded a train in Paris at midnight, opened the door of his compartment just before the train was clear of the tunnel, that he slipped and was crushed between the tunnel wall and the steps of the train, and that the wheels then passed over his body. Beekman's judgment of Mendes's oeuvre seems to differ from contemporary views, at least that of the Times, who reported that the tragic death of Mr. Mendes has brought forth expressions of sorrow from all sides, and the universal verdict is that literary France has suffered a great loss. His novels would make for interesting podcast episodes. Unfortunately, as far as I can tell, only one work of fiction by Mendes has been translated into English, a collection of short stories. When not reading Mendes's licentious fiction, Léonie is simply gazing swooningly at a collection of prints, vaguely erotic, sentimental kitsch, rosy, affected little cupids with their pinkies in the air, a young woman lying on a lace-covered bed being kissed by two frolicky angels, a floral nymph with a veil that was being torn from her by playful little cherubs. Not limited to a gauzy indolence, Léonie indulges in the pleasures of the flesh through many adulterous affairs. But these are not grand passions, merely passing fancies. These never lasted long, they counted for little in her life. She never wrote letters, and the favors which she granted afforded the recipient no privileges in the daily intercourse of society. Hers was a silent, correct depravity, both physical and moral. Her lovers are allowed sexual intercourse with her, but not daily intercourse in society, not anything that's more deeply intimate. That would require of her an ability to expose her true self, and to demonstrate genuine interest in another. But she has no self other than a sybaritic egoism. Without a sense of self, she has no interest in the inner lives of others. In dress and habit, she follows Javanese, not Dutch culture. Lying nearly naked in a sarong, the languid Léonie is awakened from an afternoon siesta by the sounds of footsteps, and she sees her screen door opening. It's her stepson Theo, who came nearer. He was dressed in pajamas, and he sat on the edge of the bed and played with her soft white hands. Suddenly he kissed her fiercely. Before they go any further, they're interrupted. A stone whizzed through the bedroom. There's an obvious explanation for where this stone came from, but it suggests someone or something is watching and reacting against their adulterous relations. Léonie is frightened, but Theo dismisses her fears and discounts the uncanny nature of this missile, and Léonie lets her fears subside, secure as she is in a room that's well isolated from the rest of the residence, from her husband, who's busy with his administrative and judicial work several rooms away. She appreciates Theo's company. In Labuwangi, he was her only vice, not counting a passing inspector. Through the blinds, they watch the two young boys, René and Ricus, 14 and 13-year-old stepsons, enjoying an encounter between a cat and a gecko lizard, also called a tokay, in imitation of the loud croaking sound it makes. The cat slunk away, withdrawing from its enemy's beady black eyes, its back arched and bristling with terror. Couperus conveys a kind of Gothic foreboding in the mysteriously thrown stone and the terrified cat. But the tone shifts as the boys seek entertainment by taunting the dozen prisoners, just as the gecko taunted the cat, who worked to maintain the residence grounds. Under the watchful eye of an overseer carrying a cane, they fetched water in tubs and watering cans made out of paraffin tins, sometimes in the actual paraffin tins themselves, and watering the plants, the grass, and the gravel. Then they swept the grounds with a loud rustle of coconut fiber brooms. The two boys throw half-eaten mangoes at the prisoners, called them names, and made faces and grimaces at them. Minor characters in the novel, René and Ricus were probably influenced by the tales of the similarly alliterative and similarly troubling Max and Moritz, written and illustrated by the German Wilhelm Busch and published in 1865. Stories that would also influence the American comic strip The Katzenjammer Kids, which began its appearance in U.S. newspapers in 1897. Couperus takes us next to the garden, several hours after the fleeing cat and tossed mangoes, for a quintessentially Orientalist scene. A colonial official, the resident Van Oudijck, and his family enjoying the splendor and comfort that come with being a high-level government official. This afternoon tea made a pleasant break in the day. Cane chairs and long-decked chairs were placed outside, in front of the house. The tea tray stood on a cane table. There were roasted bananas, and Léonie in a red silk Japanese kimono, with her fair hair hanging loose, lay back in a cane chair playing with Doddy's cockatoo and feeding it with pastry. Van Oudijck feels particularly satisfied this day with the return of his wife after a 2-month stay in Batavia. He enjoys watching his 2 young sons, those rascals romping round the garden, even though they did all sorts of mischief. And he is pleased to see Theo talking with his wife. Van Oudijck seems not to know about his young son's abuse of native prisoners, or else he dismisses such abuse as mere mischief, and he is oblivious to his son Theo's own mischief, conducting an affair with his wife in Van Oudijck's official residence while he concentrates on his many administrative duties and bureaucratic responsibilities. While blind to these offenses, he's not, as Couperus draws him, ignorant, not the usual comic cuckold. On the contrary, this 48-year-old man is a competent administrator, a man who takes his job seriously. He's grateful for his position and its abundant rewards, knowing it was not a bad life in the Indies, working for the colonial government. To be a resident, to give orders on his own initiative, to rule so large and important a district as Labuwangi, with such extensive coffee plantations, with such numerous sugar factories, that was a delight. That was a living. That was a life grander and more expansive than any other, a life that could not be compared to anything in Holland. Even though the Indies were languishing, he had been able to do much for Labuwangi. During his administration, the people had thrived and prospered. The irrigation of the rice fields was excellent. Miles and miles of tramways had been laid down. He has one regret, that his relations with Sunario, the regent, that is, the district chief, aren't more agreeable. Whereas he'd been able to understand, to admire, and to work closely with the previous district regent, Sunario's father, he finds Sunario alienating because he is wholly absorbed in all sorts of superstitious observances and fanatical speculations. Sunario seemed to him unreal, not a functionary, not a regent, merely a fanatical Javanese who always shrouded himself in mystery, which Van Oudijck dismisses as nonsense, seeing him as impractical, a degenerate Javanese, an unhinged Javanese fop. Despite this feeling, Van Oudijck, shuddering to imagine himself retired in The Hague, in a small house with a gin and bitters at the club among the old fogies, tells himself that now everything was fine. His work, his house, the Indies, there was absolutely nothing to compare with it. Although Léonie is somewhat bored living in a provincial capital rather than in Batavia, she valued the luxury of being a resident's wife, did not mind the comparative isolation since she was sufficient unto herself, and she had Theo back again. His room was close to hers. Couperus reminds us that this sexual intrigue takes place in the mysterious and alluring East Indies where, behind the velvety banyans, behind the feathery boughs of the cocoa palms, which waved like tall majestic sheaves of dark ostrich feathers, the last light of the sun through a faintly stippled, dull gold reflection, against which the softness of the banyans and the pomp of the cocoa palms stood out as though etched in black. From the distance came the monotone of the gamelan, so mournful, like a crystal clear piano of glass, with a profound dissonance at intervals. There's a sense of the hidden here, behind the banyans and behind the boughs, the palms etched in black. Like this setting, the East is secretive and seemingly unknowable to Westerners. Gamelan, the traditional music of the East Indies, is much different than the Verdi and Wagner the colonials enjoy. It relies on a variety of percussion instruments, gongish and xylophonish, as well as bamboo flutes and a bowed string instrument. Musically, its development tends to be cyclical, and it follows an entirely different system of tunings with 5 and 7 tone scales. As the contemporary Swedish composer Martin Braun explains, the main instruments in gamelan music are various types of metallophones. The common characteristic of these instruments is a partly non-harmonic sound spectrum for each single tone. Due to this fact, simultaneous tones always cause a strong component of dissonance. Much of the novel can be read as a recording of dissonance, the unharmonious relations between Europeans and the Javanese, the discord between Van Oudijck's ordered rationality and Sunario's mysticism, the off-key relationship between stepmother and stepson. This dissonance is made more discernible when Léonie, Van Oudijck, and his daughter Doddy take a carriage ride through Labuwangi. Couperus uses this ride to give the reader a feel for the setting, especially its ethnic diversity, and Van Oudijck's estrangement from it. They first drive through the Chinese quarter where the lights were lit in the little shops. The Chinese were resting in all sorts of limp attitudes, their pigtails loose or twisted around their skulls. When the carriage approached, they rose and remained standing respectfully. Chinese had been on Java for 200 years before the first Dutch ship arrived in 1596. By the 1870s, 18 million people lived on the island, 27,000 Europeans, including Eurasians, and 190,000 Chinese. Only 1.5% of the population, the Chinese dominated the local economy. At the beginning of the 19th century, writes the British diplomat and historian Victor Purcell, the Chinese had an almost uncontrolled command of the Javanese market for foreign commodities. Almost all the inland commerce was in their hands. Much of the newly created wealth as went to the Javanese, Purcell continues, passed immediately to the Chinese as holders of all the opium shops, pawn shops, and gambling houses. This wealth is soon apparent to Van Oudijck and family as they drive through an affluent section of town, with rich Chinese houses looming up softly, including the gleaming palatial villa of an immensely wealthy retired opium dealer who had made his money in the days before the opium monopoly, a gleaming palace of graceful stucco work with numerous outbuildings. The porticos of the veranda were in a monumental style of imposing elegance. The garden was beautifully filled with square pots and tall vases of dark blue and green glazed porcelain, always kept radiantly clean, a careful neatness of detail eloquent of the prosperous spick and span luxury of a Chinese opium millionaire. The Library of Congress explains that opium smoking was introduced into Java by the Dutch, who established a major port at Batavia, present-day Jakarta, and imported Indian-grown opium for local sale and later for re-export to China. Opium smoking was at first mainly a part of social life among Javanese upper classes, but in the 19th century it increasingly spread to the laborers who served the expanding colonial economy. It was under this system that some Chinese merchants accumulated wealth enough to build impressive mansions in Java. Unfortunately for these Chinese entrepreneurs, public opinion in the Netherlands saw this system as exploiting the Javanese, the ethnic Chinese pushing opium onto an indigenous population who might not otherwise have been interested. As a result, in the 1890s, the concession system was transformed into the opium regime system, in which the Dutch colonial government seized the monopolistic rights to sell opium from the ethnic Chinese, and the Dutch themselves began handling the production and sale of opium through their own stores, which restricted consumption by metering individuals' purchases. While partly motivated by a genuine concern for the welfare of the Javanese, it's also true that this new policy, known as the Opium Regie, was more lucrative for the Dutch. As James Rush, Arizona State University history professor, explains it, many of the abuses of the farm system seemed miraculously to have been resurrected in the new guard under the Regie. Only now the state took its profits directly rather than through its Chinese collaborators. Rush further explains that this new policy took place alongside a growing fear of a yellow peril. Indies Dutch were reading and hearing about a national revival in China itself. China, wrote one opium farm critic in 1889, has built a formidable fleet and has organized its army. Today, it sends off its representatives to investigate the situation of its countrymen in the possessions of European powers. Tomorrow, it will promote the legal equality of the Chinese and European inhabitants. And where will it end? While their role in the opium trade diminished, the Chinese population remained essential to the economy of Java. The Chinese, writes Couperus, gave Labuwangi its actual character of busy traffic, of trade, of making money, of living and dying. From this vibrant part of the city, Van Oudijck et al. Come to the Arab quarter, which seemed to radiate its unutterable mystery like an atmosphere of Islam that spread over the whole town, as though it were Islam that had poured forth the dusky, fatal melancholy of resignation that filled the shivering, noiseless evening. Again we're told of a mystery that inhabits this island, but inured to this fatalistic and melancholic atmosphere, the Van Oudijck family was no longer sensitive to the gloomy secret that was like the approach of a dark force, which had always breathed upon them, the rulers with their Creole blood. Here the mystery is animated, breathing upon them like some unseen animal. Van Oudijck is oblivious to this presence, Couperus explains, because he felt too intensely aware of his individuality, his authoritative, overbearing nature, to feel anything of the dark secret, to divine anything of the black peril. What is this dark force so frequently alluded to and announced in the novel's title? As one would expect of a hidden force, the answer is unclear. In this passage, in this context of what Couperus describes as a failing Dutch state, the force seems to refer to the inexorable dissolution of this rule by some kind of native essence, a threat the Van Oudijcks, habituated to this land by several generations of occupation, are oblivious to. From a carriage ride through Labuwangi, Couperus takes us to the home of Omno Eldersma and his wife Eva. He is a ridiculously overworked minor colonial official, secretary to Van Oudijck, raised in the Netherlands. She's well educated and highly cultured, the daughter of a landscape painter and concert singer who looked forward to seeing the exotic East, filled with illusions, struck by the color of the naked Malays, like that of a bronze statue, by the motley Orientalism of the Chinese and Arab quarters. But she was soon disillusioned, expecting to see everything in the Indies as a beautiful fairy tale, a story out of the Arabian Nights. She instead saw how common the houses were, with their whitewash and their rows of fragile and ugly flower pots, how filthy the natives were, and how absurd the life of the Europeans. Yet once acclimated, once she abandoned her Orientalist fantasy, she saw much of what was beautiful in the Indies. She had realized the noble majesty of nature, and the character of the Javanese had been a revelation to her, his elegance, his grace, his salutation, his dance, his aristocratic distinction, so often evidently handed down directly from a noble race. But within this beauty and majesty and elegance, she continued to feel something amiss, something strange, something she could not analyze, a certain mystery and dark secrecy, which she felt creeping softly over the land at night, a vague voice of warning no more than a whispering in the night. A newcomer, she, unlike the Van Oudijcks, who are unaware of the dark force breathing on them, is sensitive to a dark secrecy which creeps at night. It's at a gathering at Eva's home that we first meet the local regent, the 30-year-old Raden Adipati Suryo Sunario. He has a gaze that stared as though in a continuous trance. The local population is slavishly attached to him and his royal family. He enjoys a reputation for sanctity and mystery. But knowledge of the reverence in which he's held by the population doesn't keep Van Oudijck from his duty by taking advantage of this gathering to confront Sunario about his brother, the regent of another district, who, because he's losing money gambling, is not paying his workers. Inquire of your younger brother, Van Oudijck requests and demands, to what extent he has misapplied the money of the government, and make it all good as soon as possible. Otherwise, I foresee very grievous things, and I shall have to propose your brother's dismissal. Saying nothing, Sunario is none the less appalled by what he perceives as an insult against his family, an affront to his nobility, and a threat to his family's regal position, his eyes darting a mysterious hatred at the Hollander, the lowly Hollander, the base commoner, the infidel Christian, who had no business to feel anything with that unclean soul of his concerning him, his house, his father, his mother, or their supremely sacred aristocracy and nobility. The regent and the resident, with their retinue, depart, leaving behind a small group of Eva's confidants. She, a welcome addition to the European community, had gained a reputation for unusualness. Her house was unusual, her clothes unusual, the education of her child unusual. Her ideas were unusual, and the only ordinary thing about her was her Dutch Germanic husband, who was almost too ordinary in that environment. She surrounded herself with a merry little band of adherents, charming them with the Epicurean and artistic flavor of her life. With her enthusiasm for the music of Richard Wagner and her formal dinner parties, she brings a bit of European civilization to backwater Labuwangi. She makes small talk with the remaining guests, her little band of intimates, in particular Franz van Helderen, the controller, i.e., assistant to Van Oudijck. Through their conversation, we come to further understand the bifurcated culture of colonial Java, the division between the Holland-born and the Java-born, between full-blooded Dutch Javanese Creole. No character is more European, more worldly than Eva, who sees her duty as providing a touch of class, that is, a touch of Europe, in Labuwangi, holding parties where one can find the chic of a French drawing room. Her interior is designed in an Art Nouveau style, dull arabesques painted with lime on the pale gray walls, like frescoes, over the teak wainscoting carved by skillful Chinese cabinet makers, over the bronze Japanese vases on their pedestals, in which branches of bamboo and bouquets of gigantic flowers cast their shadows right up to the ceiling. Van Helderen, on the other hand, has never been to Europe. He is European in appearance and demeanor. It was very strange, notes Couperus, that this Creole, apparently quite European, tall, fair, and pale, with his fair mustache and his blue eyes, and his manners which displayed a finer courtesy than could be found in the smartest circles of Europe, did not have anything that was typically Indies in his thought, speech, or dress. Also very strange, at least to contemporary me, is the conception of race in the East Indies in the 19th century. There was no one drop of blood rule as there was in the United States South, no mulattoes or octoroons. Instead, racial identity was based on multiple factors: appearance, parentage, place of birth, and cultural identity. Van Helderen could be classified as Creole, even though he presents physically and culturally as European, because he was born in Java, just as the blonde and cream-colored Léonie is considered Creole. That is, the European community made a distinction between those who came from the Netherlands or other places in Europe and those who were born in the East Indies. This distinction was often coded racially. Despite the commonplace confusion of genes in real life, Rush explains, legally speaking, one was either European, native, or Chinese. A person's racial status determined where one could live, what taxes one paid, to which laws one was subject, before which courts one was tried. It even determined what a person could wear. According to an 1872 statute, it was illegal to appear in public attired in any manner other than that of one's ethnic group. But where, according to this scheme, did Creoles, who are neither European, native, nor Chinese, fit? They often adopted Javanese ways and were not properly educated in the ways of Europe. In addition, given the long history of intermarriage between Dutch men and Asian women, they were likely of mixed race ancestry, whatever their appearance. Francis Gouda, professor of history at the University of Amsterdam, cites the Dutch anatomist Jacob Herman Frederick Kolbrugge, who in 1911, in the magazine Colonial Weekly, observed, "Pure-blooded Europeans are rarely found in the Indies, since all second or third generation male European residents of the Indies married women who had either Indonesian or Chinese blood in their veins." However, as Olby Basma, senior researcher at the International Institute of Social History, and Remco Reben, history professor at Utrecht University, remark, the sexual contact between Europeans and members of other communities often took place in a twilight zone, not dignified by formal marriage, frequently appearing as concubinage. Such relations led to heated discussion and attempts to regulate and restrict interethnic marriages. These attempts at codifying racial difference, constraining appearance, and controlling miscegenation would largely be unsuccessful. Sumptuary laws requiring culturally appropriate dress could hardly be enforced when Europeans found native clothing such as sarongs much more comfortable for the equatorial climate of Java. In fact, Eva Eldersma violates this relaxed dress code, providing a little European civilization by stipulating that her male guests should come in formal clothes and not in their Singapore jackets without shirts. She introduced tails and white ties. The poor men objected, gasping for air at first, and felt constricted in their stiff collars. Like the attempt to establish an ethnically appropriate dress code, restrictions on interethnic marriages were hard to enforce when, given the ubiquity of racial mixing in Java, one's ethnicity couldn't be certainly defined. Franz is captivated by the unequivocal Europeanness of Eva, her knowledge and affect and social graces, her gentle resistance to the conventions of colonial culture. He imagines attending the Paris exhibition to be held in 1900, which was a paean to modernity with its Ferris wheel and moving sidewalk and moving pictures by the brothers Lumiere. Ironically, if he were to visit the Dutch pavilion, he wouldn't find a building of European classical or contemporary design, but instead a reconstruction of an ancient Buddhist temple with casts that had been made from other temples on Java. Marika Bloembergen, professor of Indonesian history at the University of Leiden, and Martijn Eickhoff, professor of archaeology at the University of Groningen, give us some of the details. The centerpiece of the Netherlands entry at the 1900 Paris exhibition was a plaster cast replica of the Buddhist temple Kandisari, surrounded by plaster casts of Borobudur and other temple art from Java. The molds for this Javanese temple show were made on location in Java, the casts in Holland. By way of a finishing touch, the organizers also produced a mold and cast of a great treasure in the National Ethnographic Museum in Leiden, the 13th century Singsari statue of Prajna Paramita, then and now referred to as the Mona Lisa of Java. The statue was returned to Indonesia in 1978. Such sensitivity to cultural appropriation wasn't apparent at the fair, where instead of a 17th century Dutch regent's chamber, observes Blombergen, it was an ancient Javanese temple that formed the centerpiece of the Netherlands' entries to the World Exhibition in Paris. Unlike other countries who had a pavilion on the Rue des Nations, which Blombergen describes as the avenue of honor in which each country presented an overview of its national history and architectural style, the Netherlands chose to present itself wholly through East Indies-like structures in a different section of the exhibition devoted to colonial territories. There are several reasons for this seemingly odd decision to not have a building reflecting the Netherlands' national identity. One is quite simple. The Netherlands would have been hard-pressed to afford the design and construction of multiple exhibitions. But why choose Java over the Netherlands? Blombergen and Eickhoff suggest a renewed national pride after victory in the Aceh War, also known as the Dutch War or the Infidel War, a nearly quarter of a century-long fight against the Aceh kingdom on Sumatra, and after another martial triumph, the successful Dutch intervention in the rebellion of the Sasak people against Balinese rule on the island of Lombok. These successes reinforced a belief in the efficacy and the humanity of Dutch colonialism versus the crueler and more chaotic policies of the other Western colonial powers. Its earlier culture system had been championed as a better manner of colonial rule. As I said in episode 25, the Calcutta-based British lawyer James Money spent 2 months in Java, where he was impressed with the efficient functioning of the culture system, leading him to write Java, or How to Manage a Colony, showing a practical solution to the questions now affecting British India. Sympathetic to Money's argument, Alfred Russel Wallace praised the culture system, which he had observed firsthand during a 3-month stay in the Indies. I believe that the Dutch system is the very best that can be adopted when a European nation conquers or otherwise acquires possession of a country inhabited by industrious but semi-barbarous people. At this point, the Dutch, having replaced the culture system with the liberal policy, were reinventing their colonial system again, leading to what would be called the ethical policy, what its proponents saw as a noble experiment designed to transform Indonesian society, to enable a new elite to share in the riches of Western civilization, and to bring the colony into the modern world. A small nation with an outsized Asian colony, the Netherlands did not take part in the scramble for Africa or otherwise gain new territories. At the height of imperialism, then, the Dutch took pride in what they saw as a superior way to run a colony, one both ethical and economical. A French visitor to the Dutch pavilion at an earlier fair couldn't decide which he admired more, the objects on display, the work of the natives, or the talent for colonization possessed by this small nation, which has contrived to shape and preserve such a vast colonial empire. This choice to focus on its East Indies colony was also an assertion of the Netherlands' place in the global order. That is, its neighbors, Britain, France, Belgium, and Germany, all had substantial colonies, especially in Africa. The Dutch sought to place themselves within this imperial pantheon. They were also reinforcing their claim to the East Indies in order to preempt what they feared might be an attempt by the United States, who had just defeated Spain and gained control of Cuba and the Philippines, to make their national destiny even more manifest. However, we shouldn't completely discount more benign motives. Much of the enthusiasm behind the decision to foreground the East Indies came from academics and administrators who were genuinely enthralled by the deep history of Java and Sumatra as seen in Hindu and Buddhist ruins, which Dutch scholars had photographed and studied, and whose results were displayed in Europe for the first time. Less benign, but also a factor in this decision, was the Western fascination with the East in all its Orientalist mystery and splendor, though this feature was more apparent in the Paris exhibition of 1889, in which the Dutch erected an East Indian village of bamboo houses that was stocked with 60 natives from Java and Sumatra, who demonstrated their arts and crafts and music. This presentation was both exotic and scientific. Bloembergen explains that the French had enlisted the help of anthropologists, ethnographers, archaeologists, and prehistorians. They helped to chart existing knowledge regarding human nature and the age of humanity, and regarding humanity's physical features and states of civilization. Bloembergen further explains that in the primary anthropological framework of the Exposition Universelle, the exotic ways of life and the products of traditional craftsmanship on show there also illustrated a stage in the history of the progress of civilizations. In other words, the comparatively more primitive stage of native cultural development justified European colonialism. The rational anthropological investigation of such cultures, with its categorizing and defining and enumerating and collecting and displaying and mapping, likewise demonstrated European superiority. Speaking of colonial archaeological interest in monumental ancient structures, the political scientist and historian Benedict Anderson suggests that the reconstructed monuments juxtaposed with the surrounding rural poverty said to the natives, "Our very presence shows that you have always been, or have long become, incapable of either greatness or self-rule." These considerations aside, it's worth noting that the Dutch exhibit in 1889 drew huge crowds, among whom were the composer Claude Debussy, who, writes Bloembergen, was bewitched by the Javanese gamelan music, which became a source of inspiration for some of his innovative compositions for piano, as well as the painter Paul Gauguin, who would travel to Tahiti for artistic inspiration, and the writers Émile Zola and Edmond de Goncourt. The music heard in the interludes for this episode, by the way, is an excerpt from a piano composition by Claude Debussy, Estampe, a suite of 3 movements, the first of which, Pagodas, Wikipedia explains, evokes Indonesian gamelan music. It makes extensive use of pentatonic scales and mimics traditional Indonesian melodies. The ornate roofs of pagodas that typically curve upwards are much like the ascending melodic line. Here's a brief pairing of the two. First gamelan, second Debussy. Since we're speaking of French artists and Java, I'll take this opportunity to consider another work, Honoré de Balzac's My Journey from Paris to Java. In this imaginary trip to Java, writing at the beginning of his career, Balzac conveys many of the exotic Orientalist views of his time, describing a landscape which includes not just alien but deadly fauna, notably the upas tree, which Balzac reports grows at the center of an extinct volcano and whose sap is extremely poisonous. Not only does the sap give a dagger plunged into it the power of death, but the tree exhales its murderous vapor so quickly and with such intensity that its shade will kill a man who stays under it any longer than is necessary to prick the trunk with the dagger. Air as it passes by the tree becomes fatal in the immediate vicinity. The Javanese people in Balzac's account are as false as is his description of the natural world. Javanese women, he says, are mad about European men, and strikingly, women there are as white and smooth as the finest vellum. No shade of color touches their complexion. Their lips are pale, their ears and their nostrils all are white, only their fine black eyebrows and their brown eyes contrast with this bizarre pallor. In keeping with this male fantasy, Balzac tells us that these women are scantily dressed, that their eyes burn with the languid beauty of a gazelle, that most of them are rich and live in unbridled luxury. Javanese women worship men more than God, but they do not mourn their passing. In fact, they forget about their husbands after they've died. And of course, there is a serpent in this garden. The sudden deaths of many European men are caused by the murderous jealousy of their Javanese wives and their skill at preparing poisoned beverages. These women, Balzac reveals, want you so completely that they will not forgive you even one glance at arrival. But if the pleasures of their company are so dearly bought and so perilous, it must be recognized that they are immense. I don't want to hold Balzac's account to an unfair standard of verisimilitude, since he's writing very early in his career, since he's following in the tradition of Europeans writing fanciful travelogues about remote places, and since he had a penchant, despite his reputation as a realist, for writing fantastic tales. But it's worth noting just how far from reality this fantasy was. At the time he was writing, the Javanese could be enslaved by the Dutch. If there were light-skinned women, it was because, for many, they had had sexual relations with European men, likely as concubines who, with their children, were frequently abandoned when these men returned to their home countries. However much he gets wrong, however much we can see that this is meant as a fantasy, the notion that Javanese women are uniquely beautiful and uniquely sensual and uniquely committed to pleasing European men remains even now a common stereotype about Asian women, a stereotype that promotes child prostitution and sex trafficking. Moving from Balzac's Java to Couperus's, we hear the conversation around Eva and Franz turn to what after-party conversations always turn to: gossip about the departed guests, in this case about the scandalous wife of the resident. The wife of the senior engineer, Mrs. Dame de Bruin, placid, melancholy, and quietly venomous, like Balzac's Javanese, says she's heard that this time one member of council, one head of a department, and 3 young businessmen kept Léonie amused in Batavia. The doctor suggests she receives an unspecified medical treatment when there, perhaps treatment for venereal disease or unwanted pregnancy. At that, Eva interrupts, entreating the guests not to speak evil of this woman who possesses a tranquil Juno-esque beauty and the eyes of Venus, and, she declares, I can forgive beautiful people everything, an almost Wildian sentiment in keeping with fin de siècle aestheticism. In fact, Couperus was an admirer of and had a brief correspondence with Oscar Wilde, who had himself admired one of Couperus's novels, Footsteps of Fate, and who sent him a copy of his recently printed The Picture of Dorian Gray. After briefly wondering if Léonie's husband, the resident, knows about his wife's multiple infidelities, the guests shift their conversation to what they'd observed earlier, the problem of the regent, one person saying he should be sacked, another that he's too highly regarded by the population to do so, Franz concluding, as was implicit in the Dutch exhibit in Paris, that the more lenient treatment of the Dutch in their colonies is better than the British policies, which have resulted in continual poverty and famine. Franz is alluding to a background that is detailed by the historian Mike Davis in his book Late Victorian Holocausts. Davis recounts the serial famines that occurred in India during the late 19th century, which he traces to natural disasters, to British policies, and to the cruel demands of global trade. Davis notes that an essay in the British medical journal The Lancet from 1901 suggested that a conservative estimate of excess mortality in India in the previous decade was 19 million. It's a given within this crowd that Dutch colonialism is more humane than British colonialism. The question is it too humane, too lenient? The problem with Van Oudijck, Franz explains, is that he holds the current regent, who's a fanatic, and his brother, who's a gambler, to a romanticized version of their father. Eva responds with her own romanticizing, seeing these royal natives as exotic decorations. The regent is a living Wajang puppet, except for his maniacal eyes, his young wife an exquisite little doll, who looks very decorative. Eva appreciates these Javanese for how well they adorn her home, how much they can add to her Art Nouveau design. If Eva thinks in terms of aesthetics, Franz, in this scene, looks realistically, not decoratively, at the regent and the Dutch colonial system, revealing that the regent and family have gambled away their possessions, can barely support their extended family in the luxury required by Javanese custom. Every regent, Franz explains, collects his whole family around him like parasites, clothes them, feeds them, provides them with pocket money. This observation is quickly lost in the drift of their desultory talk, recognizing that they've exhausted their conversation and their usual entertainments, dances, parties, picnics, trips to the mountains. Eva, hostess and a kind of unofficial social director, seeks something new. This desire reflects something of Couperus's own feelings, as he expressed in an essay on monotony. I am monotony's slave. Monotony is the gray, shrouded matron who regulates my entire life with boredom. I am always myself. It's hopelessly monotonous always to be myself. Why don't I live 100 existences? If only I were someone else every day. If only tomorrow morning were presently to become a party, a night of orgy, and if for once, as soon as I opened my eyes in the morning, I were to find myself a Roman emperor being worshipped. I am monotonously and unchangeably always a man, a Dutchman, a writer, someone from a good family, and I always have the same vices and virtues. Eva's monotony leads her to talk about life in Labuwangi. Those brown faces of my boys around me suddenly strike me as uncanny. The Indies frighten me at times. Do any of you ever feel that? A vague dread, a mystery in the air, something menacing? I don't know what it is. The evenings are sometimes so full of mystery, and there is something mysterious in the character of the native, who is remote from us, who differs so much from us. As a newcomer to Java, Eva is more sensitive to these differences, to the mystery, but the native-born Franz dismisses her observations as artistic feelings. For something new, one of the guests suggests they engage in a session of table turning, an entertainment that arose in the 19th century with the spread of spiritualism. According to the 1911 Encyclopedia Britannica, the most popular method of consulting the spirits was for several persons to sit round a table with their hands resting on it and wait for the table to move. If the experiment was successful, the table would rotate with considerable rapidity and would occasionally rise in the air or perform other movements. Communication with the spirits was accomplished by reciting the alphabet and marking at what letters the table moved. The Britannica's entry on table turning concludes by noting, "Table turning is still in vogue amongst spiritualist circles. The device was employed with success by Professor Charles Richet and others in thought transference experiments." Richet, a French physiologist who won the Nobel Prize for his discovery of anaphylaxis, believed in the existence of a human sixth sense. Things like table turnings and medium-led seances with paranormal occurrences, he believed, were not evidence of a separate spirit world, but of unrecognized human abilities such as psychokinesis. At the time, many otherwise rational observers believed that table turnings and other unexplained phenomena did demonstrate the existence of a spirit world, of the dead contacting the living. Writing about the modern spiritual development of the human race, Arthur Conan Doyle declared spiritualism the most important development in the history of the world since the Christ episode. Interestingly, in this same book, for asserting that spiritualism was a fraud, Doyle derides Frank Podmore, a former member of the Oxford Phasmatological Society, who was forced to resign from the British Post Office because of allegations of homosexuality, but whose sin to Doyle was authoring the book Studies in Psychical Research, as well as the Britannica's skeptical entry on table turning that I've cited. Doyle complained that Mr. Frank Podmore brought together a large number of the facts, and by ignoring those which did not suit his purpose, endeavored to suggest the worthlessness of most of the rest, especially the physical phenomena, which in his view were mainly the result of fraud. He was, to Doyle, one of the many purported scholars who denied the truth of spiritualism, leading to Doyle's composing his two-volume, nearly 700-page History of Spiritualism, which, besides tracing its history and its current practice, features chapters on ectoplasm and spirit photography. The vogue for spiritualism began in 1848 in New York State, when two sisters, Margaretta and Catherine Fox, claimed they were communicating with spirits through raps on their homes' walls and furniture. They subsequently became mediums who held public seances. 40 years later, Margaretta admitted they'd fabricated the rapping noises by cracking their knuckles and other joints. but by that time their rapping music had crossed the Atlantic and generated an enthusiasm for spiritualism throughout Europe, not just in the form of rapping, but in many guises, as was satirized in 1858 by the Westminster Review. There is hardly a piece of domestic furniture that does not perform the most extraordinary and equally well attested feats. Tongs and pokers leave their places and pile themselves on the tops of beds. Plated candlesticks, bent upon suicide, beat themselves to pieces on the floor. Brushes and tumblers of water rise from their places, dash through the window panes, and fall in the street. Belief in the supernatural has, of course, always been with us. I document in episode 24, for instance, the popularity of tarot reading in 18th and 19th century France. But from the mid-19th century onwards, spiritualism in its various guises, rapping, table-turning, automatic writing, the Ouija board, seances, grew in parallel with the rise in science and the spread of technology. On the one hand, spiritualism was a response to the secularizing and rationalizing and consequent demystification of the world, a belief that there had to be more to human existence than the prosaic rationality of science and the quotidian banalities of daily life. On the other hand, spiritualism was considered an extension of the scientific worldview. If science had found and harnessed unseen forces, as shown by the telegraph and the electric light, and if understanding of the body required instruments that revealed a complexity unknowable to the naked eye, then it was likely that the similarly invisible world of the metaphysical, of the paranormal and the spirit, had merely not yet been uncovered. Christine Ferguson, lecturer in 19th century literature at the University of Glasgow, summarizes both views. One, a purely reactionary formation, a desperate backwards clinging to the consolatory faith in spiritual immortality that contemporary science was rapidly eroding, and two, deference to the logic of a newly authoritative empirical epistemology, one that insisted that knowledge be derived from direct observation rather than faith. Ferguson supports the latter position. But I hold that both factors, a desire to be re-enchanted with the world and confidence that science would unravel these metaphysical mysteries, contributed to the era's preoccupation with spiritualism. Table turning was only one way that spiritualists communicated with the ineffable. It seems, too, that tables themselves could communicate in a variety of ways. As the Westminster Review joked, in addition to air floating, the movements of tables are of the most surprisingly varied kind. Sometimes their motion is grave and thoughtful, sometimes frolicsome, if we may so speak, and fantastic, and sometimes not unlike the noisy hilarity of a man in liquor. In turning tables, then, Eva's guests are taking part in a popular parlor game that was also an expression of cultural doubt and anxiety. These uncertain feelings are exacerbated by the alien world, both cultural and natural, that surrounds Eva and her European and Eurasian guests. At their table turning, nothing is revealed about the afterlife, but much is revealed about Léonie's sex life. The table lifted a leg, described an angry, grating semicircle over the marble floor, and put its leg down with a violent bang. Then it spells out Léonie's name. When the guests ask for more information about Léonie, the table responds with what Couperus calls a coarse word. From this table talk, the guests learn that Léonie is connected to Theo and to Addie. They also learn that there will be a frightful war between Europe and China, presumably a reference to the Boxer Rebellion, and that Labuwangi will face a dangerous rebellion led by Sunario. At the end of the session, one of the guests, Franz's wife, Ida, says she sees a Haji, that is, someone who has made the pilgrimage to Mecca, leaving the grounds. But then she realizes it's just the moonlight. It was 2 o'clock, writes Couperus. The moonlight was streaming down on the town, which lay deathly silent, slumbering in the velvet shadows of the gardens. We're back to the opening of the novel, to a moonlit night conjuring images of mortality, the Java landscape redolent with a transcendent mystery which has just communicated with these mystified Europeans. The next day, Eva runs into Franz, who says he's in love with her. Although his wife Ida is light-skinned, he tells her, she's by nature Javanese. By contrast, you, he breathlessly admits, were a revelation to me, a revelation of all the charm and artistic grace that a woman can possess. Ida always tried to behave in a very European fashion, to speak Dutch well, and even pretended to speak bad Malay, and to care for neither rice-staffel nor rujak, native rice and fruit dishes. But this pretense is made ridiculous by the elegant and educated Eva. Meeting her has made Franz feel like he's missed everything in life by never having been out of Java, and he imagines the two of them going to Bayreuth to hear Wagner. Eva spurns his advances and tries to cheer him up by pointing to what must be important work he does to help maintain the colonial administration. And she reminds him that foreigners are all enchanted with the glory of the Indies, with our methods of colonization. But he will have none of it, repudiating the once great colony in a language worthy of Multatuli. It's an exhausted colony, still governed from Holland with one idea, to make a profit. The country sucked dry, and the real population, the native population, is now threatening to revolt against this oppression and disdain. He concludes, I see the danger as something very real, something arising for Holland, if not from America and Japan, then from the soil of this country itself. This fear of American interest in the East Indies is understandable since, as I noted earlier, the U.S. had only recently defeated the Spanish and had occupied the Philippines, where they were engaged in a violent suppression of Filipino resistance. The fear voiced here of Japanese imperialism was prescient. Japan would occupy the East Indies from 1942 until the Japanese surrender in 1945. Likewise, the fear that something would arise from the soil of the country itself would also come true. After 4 years of violent struggle, Indonesia gained its independence from the Netherlands in December 1949. Upon his departure, Eva sinks into melancholy, seeing life as one long self-deception, a wandering amid illusions. Oh God, she goes on, how paltry everything is, and how we wander around without knowing anything. The appearance of her little child does little to change her mood, imagining that his life might offer nothing new, might be a repetition of what has so often been before. These feelings of the meaninglessness of life are exacerbated by life in Java. Oh, when we feel like this, she tells herself, how oppressive the Indies can be. Almost everyone feels this way, she knows. The only happy people are exceptions, like Léonie Van Oudijck, who lives no different from a beautiful flower or a beautiful animal. It's only the person who has no interior existence, who doesn't contemplate life's seeming pointlessness, who lives in a languorous dream state, it seems, who is immune to existential dread, a dread made worse by the narrow social circle and provincial manners and alien culture which circumscribe a European's life in the East Indies. For a transcript of this episode,
Along with a bibliography and other materials, please go to 19thcenturynovel.podbean.com.